Burning sorrows at sundown. Emmy Sullivan had spent her whole life keeping her land safe, but when Garrett Landry rode onto her property, all quiet strength and a past he wouldn't talk about, she knew her hardest battle had just begun. He crossed his arms, watching her. "You don't trust me, do you?" he murmured. "That's all right, sweetheart. I ain't a skin you too." Chapter 1. The Shadow of Sundown Creek. The dust swirled around Emmy Sullivan's worn boots, a familiar dance partner in the ceaseless ballet of the wind that swept across Sundown Ranch. It was a harsh land, this corner of Arizona territory, but it was hers. Every cracked inch of soil, every stubborn blade of grass that fought its way to the sun, echoed the resilience she carried within her. At 58, Emmy wasn't the young woman who'd first ridden these acres, but the land had etched its strength onto her soul, weathering her heart as it had the mesas that rose in the distance. She stood on the porch of the ranch house, the weathered wood groaning softly beneath her weight, a sound as familiar as her own heartbeat. The house, like Emmy, had seen better days. Paint peeled from the clapboard siding, a testament to the relentless sun and the years of neglect. It had been her father's pride, then her husband's burden, and now, finally, hers alone. A responsibility, a legacy, a sanctuary. Her gaze swept across the vast expanse of the ranch, her eyes, the color of faded denim, narrowed against the glare of the late afternoon sun. The cattle, dots of brown and black against the ochre landscape, were grazing peacefully near Sundown Creek, a thin, silver ribbon that snaked its way through the heart of her property. It was the lifeblood of the ranch, the reason her father had fought so hard to claim this land, the reason she continued to fight, even now, with the ghost of her late husband, Thomas, a constant, silent presence beside her. Thomas. The name still caught in her throat, a bittersweet ache that had dulled but never truly faded in the 5 years since he'd been taken, not by the land, but by a sickness that had crept into their lives as silently and relentlessly as the desert night. He'd been a good man, Thomas, a hard worker, but the ranch had always felt like a weight on his shoulders, a yoke he'd never quite managed to bear with grace. Emmy, on the other hand, wore the ranch like a second skin. It was in her blood, in her bones, in the very air she breathed. She'd learned to read the land as easily as she'd once read the worn pages of her mother's Bible. She knew the subtle shift in the wind that heralded a coming storm, the scent of rain on the dry earth, the language of the hawks that circled overhead. She knew the rhythm of life and death on the frontier, the delicate balance between survival and surrender. A movement in the distance caught her eye. A lone rider, approaching from the east, a dark silhouette against the fiery backdrop of the setting sun. Emmy's hand instinctively moved to the worn leather holster at her hip, the weight of the Colt Peacemaker a familiar comfort. She hadn't used it in years, not since the days when rustlers and outlaws were a more common threat, but the instinct to protect her land, her home, was ingrained in her. As the rider drew closer, she could make out the details. A tall figure on a muscular bay horse, a wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. He rode with an easy grace, a confidence that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. There was something about him, a quiet intensity, that set her nerves on edge. He wasn't one of her hands, she knew them all by name and sight. This was a stranger, and strangers in this part of the territory often meant trouble. He reined in his horse at the edge of the yard, the animal snorting and pawing the ground, its breath misting in the cool evening air. The rider dismounted, his movements fluid and economical, and Emmy felt a prickle of unease, a sense of vulnerability she hadn't experienced in years. He was tall, taller than Thomas had been, with broad shoulders and a lean, muscular build. His face, when he finally lifted his head, was weathered and tanned, etched with the lines of a hard life. His eyes, though, were what held her attention. They were a startling shade of blue, a sharp contrast to the darkness of his hair and the stubble that shadowed his jaw. They were eyes that had seen too much, eyes that held a hint of sadness, of weariness, but also a spark of something else, defiance, perhaps, or maybe just the stubborn refusal to be broken. He removed his hat, holding it in one hand, and ran the other through his thick, dark hair, a gesture that seemed both casual and strangely intimate. He didn't speak, just stood there, watching her, his blue eyes unwavering. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. Emmy felt her heart beating a little faster, a strange mixture of apprehension and something else, something she couldn't quite name. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time, a stirring of something deep within her that she thought had long since withered and died. "You're on my land," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands. Her words were a challenge, a declaration of ownership, a reminder that she was not a woman to be trifled with. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "I know," he replied, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that sent a shiver down her spine. It was a voice that had spoken to the wind and the rain, a voice that knew the secrets of the desert. "I'm looking for the owner." "You're looking at her," Emmy said, squaring her shoulders, meeting his gaze head-on. She wouldn't back down, not from him, not from anyone. She'd faced down worse than a lone rider with eyes that seemed to see right through her. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in every detail, from the faded calico dress she wore to the lines of worry etched around her eyes, the silver strands that threaded through her dark hair. She felt exposed, vulnerable, under his scrutiny, as if he could see all the years, all the losses, all the battles she'd fought and won, and the ones she'd lost. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer now, less guarded. "Emmeline Sullivan?" The sound of her name, spoken in that low, resonant drawl, sent another shiver through her. It had been a long time since anyone had called her anything but Emmy. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He extended a hand, calloused and rough, but with a gentleness that surprised her. "Garrett Landry." She hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering from his outstretched hand to his face, searching for any sign of deception, of threat. But there was nothing there, only a quiet sincerity, a weariness that mirrored her own. Slowly, she reached out and took his hand. His grip was firm, warm, and surprisingly reassuring. It was the hand of a working man, a man who knew the feel of leather and rope, the weight of a gun, the strength of a horse. "What brings you to Sundown Ranch, Mr. Landry?" she asked, her voice regaining some of its strength. He released her hand, and the absence of his touch left a strange emptiness in her palm. He looked out across the ranch, his gaze sweeping across the vast expanse of land, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. "I'm looking for work," he said, his voice barely audible above the whisper of the wind. "And maybe something more." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Emmy felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She didn't need another hand. She had a few loyal men who'd been with her for years, and she managed just fine. But there was something about this man, something in his eyes, in his voice, that made her hesitate. Something that told her he was more than just a drifter looking for a job. He crossed his arms, watching her. "You don't trust me, do you?" he murmured. "That's all right, sweetheart. I ain't asking you to." He turned away slightly, gazing at the distant horizon, hiding something. Or everything. Chapter 2. A stranger's hand on her land. Emmy watched him, her eyes narrowed, assessing. He leaned against the porch railing, the weathered wood groaning under his weight, a counterpoint to the similar sound of the porch under her own boots just moments before. It was as if the ranch itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, making him appear even taller, more imposing. He hadn't shaved in days, the dark stubble accentuating the sharp angles of his jaw. There was a hardness to him, a sense of self-reliance forged in the crucible of a difficult life. But it was his eyes that kept drawing her back. That startling blue, like a flash of sky in a desert storm. "I don't need another hand," she said, the words sounding harsher than she intended, even to her own ears. It wasn't entirely true. She could use the help, especially with the upcoming cattle drive, but pride and a healthy dose of caution kept her from admitting it. He didn't seem surprised by her response. He simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where the last sliver of the sun was sinking below the mesas. I understand, he said, his voice low and even. It's a hard life, this. Not many women run a ranch on their own. There was no judgment in his tone, no hint of condescension, just a simple statement of fact. It was that, more than anything, that started to chip away at Emmy's defenses. She was used to men either pitying her or trying to take advantage of her perceived weakness. Garrett Landry seemed to do neither. I manage, she replied, her voice a little softer now. She gestured towards the bunkhouse, a small, ramshackle building a short distance from the main house. My men are loyal. They've been with me for years. Loyalty's a rare commodity these days, he said, turning his head to look at her, his blue eyes searching hers. Especially out here. Emmy met his gaze, unflinching. It's all I have, she said, the words heavy with the weight of her past, the loss of her husband, the constant struggle to keep the ranch afloat. He seemed to understand, to see the weariness in her eyes, the lines of worry etched on her face. He pushed himself away from the railing, his movements slow and deliberate. I'm not looking to take anything from you, Mrs. Sullivan, he said, his voice sincere. I'm just looking for a place to rest. For a while, anyway. There was something in his voice, a hint of vulnerability, that caught her off guard. It was as if he were carrying a burden, a secret sorrow that he couldn't quite hide. It resonated with the echoes of her own grief, the loneliness that had become her constant companion. She hesitated, her mind warring with her instincts. Her head told her to send him on his way, to protect herself, her ranch, from the unknown. But her heart whispered something different. It urged her to take a chance, to offer this stranger a helping hand, to see if maybe, just maybe, he could offer her something in return. The work is hard, she said, testing him, watching his reaction. Long hours, little pay. And this land, it can be unforgiving. He smiled then, a slow, wry smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. It was a smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, less haunted. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mrs. Sullivan, he said. And I've known unforgiving land before. Emmy studied him for another long moment, her gaze taking in every detail, from the worn leather of his chaps to the calluses on his hands. She saw the strength in him, the resilience, but she also saw something else, a flicker of hope, a yearning for something more. All right, Mr. Landry, she said, finally making her decision. You can stay. For a while. But you understand, I don't tolerate trouble. You cause any problems, you're gone. No questions asked. His smile widened, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, making them sparkle like the desert sky after a rain. Fair enough, he said, extending his hand again. Emmy took it, her hand swallowed up in his. His grip was firm, reassuring, and she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, a feeling she'd almost forgotten. Come on, she said, turning towards the house. I'll show you to the bunkhouse. You can get settled in. Supper's in an hour. He followed her, his steps silent on the dusty ground. As they walked, Emmy couldn't help but steal glances at him. He moved with an easy grace, a quiet confidence that both intrigued and unnerved her. She wondered about his past, about the secrets he carried, about the reason he'd ended up at her doorstep, looking for work and something more. The bunkhouse was simple, Spartan but clean. It held 4 narrow cots, a rough-hewn table, and a few chairs. A pot-bellied stove stood in the corner, providing the only source of heat. It ain't much, Emmy said, her voice echoing in the small space. But it's dry and it's got a roof. It's more than enough, Garrett replied, his gaze sweeping across the room. He set his saddlebags down on one of the cots, the leather creaking softly. My men, they're good men, Emmy said, feeling the need to explain, to justify her decision. But they're set in their ways. They might not take kindly to a stranger. Garrett turned to face her, his blue eyes thoughtful. I understand, he said. I'll do my best to earn their trust. Emmy nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief. She didn't know why she was so concerned about his acceptance by her men, but she was. It was as if, on some level, she already knew that Garrett Landry was going to be more than just another hired hand. He was a disruption, a change in the carefully orchestrated routine of her life, a presence she felt it wouldn't be easy to push away. "Supper's at 7, she said, turning to leave. "Don't be late." She walked out in the quiet of the evening. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of glory, and she heard the soft clink of his spurs, a different sound of her ranch. Something felt oddly unsettled. Chapter 3. Echoes of Gunfire and Regret. The aroma of stewed beef and beans, mingled with the scent of freshly baked bread, filled the small, rustic kitchen of the ranch house. Emmy moved around the room with a practiced efficiency, her movements honed by years of preparing meals for herself and her men. The kitchen was the heart of the house, a warm, inviting space that had witnessed countless conversations, shared meals, and moments of quiet reflection. The worn wooden table, scarred with knife marks and coffee stains, held a history of its own, a silent testament to the lives that had gathered around it. She glanced out the window, watching as Garrett Landry emerged from the bunkhouse. He'd washed up, she noticed, and changed into a clean, if somewhat faded, shirt. He moved with a natural grace, his long strides eating up the distance between the bunkhouse and the main house. There was a stillness about him, a quiet intensity that both intrigued and unsettled her. He paused at the edge of the porch, his gaze sweeping across the ranch, taking in the darkening sky, the silhouettes of the cattle grazing in the distance. He seemed to be absorbing the atmosphere, the silence, the vastness of the land. Emmy wondered what he was thinking, what memories were stirring within him. He carried his past like a shadow, a silent companion that never left his side. She turned away from the window, her heart beating a little faster. She wasn't used to having strangers in her house, especially men. After Thomas had passed, she'd grown accustomed to her solitude, to the quiet routine of her life. Garrett Landry's presence was a disruption, a challenge to the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her heart. He knocked softly on the doorframe, a hesitant sound that belied his imposing figure. "Come in," Emmy called, her voice steadier than she felt. He stepped inside, removing his hat, holding it in one hand. The lamplight illuminated his face, revealing the lines of fatigue etched around his eyes, the stubble that shadowed his jaw. He looked tired, she thought, but there was a strength in him, a resilience that she couldn't help but admire. "Smells good," he said, his voice a low rumble that filled the small space. "It's just stew," Emmy replied, turning back to the stove, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. "Nothing fancy." "Fancy ain't always better," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the simple furnishings, the worn rugs, the faded curtains. "Sometimes simple is all you need." Emmy felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of comfort she hadn't expected. She'd grown so used to her own company, to the silence of the house, that she'd forgotten the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with another person. "Sit down," she said, gesturing towards the table. "The men will be in shortly." He pulled out a chair and sat down, his long legs stretching out beneath the table. He watched her as she moved around the kitchen, setting out plates and bowls, pouring coffee into tin cups. He didn't speak, but his presence filled the room, a silent energy that made her acutely aware of him. The sound of boots on the porch heralded the arrival of her men. Jed, the foreman, a grizzled, weathered man who'd been with Emmy's family for over 30 years, entered first, followed by Billy, a young, eager hand who'd only been with them a few months, and Silas, a quiet, stoic man who'd lost his own ranch to a bank foreclosure and had come to Emmy looking for work. They stopped short when they saw Garrett, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. Jed's hand instinctively moved to the gun belt at his hip, a reflex born of years of living in a lawless land. "Evening, Jed," Emmy said, her voice calm and steady. "This is Garrett Landry. He'll be working with us for a while." Jed grunted, his gaze fixed on Garrett. "Heard you were looking for a hand," he said, his voice gruff. "Didn't figure you'd find one so quick." "Mr. Landry came at the right time," Emmy replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. Jed nodded, his gaze still assessing Garrett. He'd known Emmy since she was a child, had watched her grow into a strong, independent woman. He respected her, even if he didn't always agree with her decisions. "We'll see how he works out," he said, finally turning away from Garrett and taking his usual seat at the head of the table. Billy and Silas followed suit, their eyes still lingering on the newcomer. The meal was a quiet affair, punctuated by the clinking of forks and spoons, the occasional murmur of conversation. Garrett ate slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite. He didn't try to force himself into the conversation, but he listened attentively, his blue eyes observing the dynamics between Emmy and her men. Emmy found herself watching him, too, curious about his past, his motivations. He was a mystery, an enigma, and she couldn't help but be drawn to him. She'd always been a good judge of character, and her instincts told her that Garrett Landry was a good man, despite the shadows that haunted his eyes. After the meal, as the men were finishing their coffee, a sudden, sharp crack echoed from outside. It was the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Jed was on his feet instantly, his hand reaching for his gun. "Trouble," he muttered, his eyes scanning the darkness outside the window. Emmy felt a surge of adrenaline, her heart pounding in her chest. She'd faced trouble before, rustlers, outlaws, the constant threat of violence that was a part of life on the frontier. But it had been a while since she'd heard the sound of gunfire so close to home. Garrett stood up, too, his movements calm and deliberate. He didn't reach for a gun, but his eyes were alert, his body tense, ready for anything. "Stay here," Jed ordered Emmy, his voice gruff. "Me and the boys will check it out." Emmy wanted to protest, to argue that it was her ranch, her responsibility, but she knew Jed was right. He was the experienced one, the one who knew how to handle this kind of situation. "Be careful," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jed nodded, and then he and the other two men were gone, disappearing into the darkness. Emmy and Garrett were left alone in the kitchen, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire in the stove and the distant sound of more gunshots. Emmy felt a shiver run down her spine, a sense of dread settling over her. She'd lived with violence all her life, but it never got any easier. Garrett stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the darkness, his body tense, listening. He seemed to be anticipating something, waiting for the next move. "What do you think it is?" Emmy asked, her voice trembling slightly. He turned to look at her, his blue eyes filled with a strange mixture of concern and something else. Something that looked like regret. "I don't know," he said, his voice low and somber. "But I have a feeling it's just the beginning." He sighed and shook his head. "I bring trouble with me, wherever I go, it seems." His voice was heavy, his words echoing in the room. Chapter 4. The Weight of a Weathered Saddle. The echoes of the gunshots faded into the night, leaving behind a heavy silence that pressed down on Emmy. Garrett's words, "I bring trouble with me, wherever I go," hung in the air, a chilling premonition. She looked at him, searching his face for answers, for reassurance, but found only a weary resignation. He seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, a burden of past mistakes and regrets. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She needed to understand, to know what she was dealing with. This man, this stranger, had walked into her life and brought with him a storm, a darkness that threatened to engulf her carefully ordered world. He turned away from the window, running a hand through his hair, a gesture that had already become familiar to her. He looked tired, defeated, as if he'd been fighting a losing battle for too long. "It's a long story," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "One I'm not proud of." "I have time," Emmy replied, her voice firm. She wasn't afraid of long stories. Her own life was a testament to the endurance of the human spirit, the ability to survive hardship and loss. He hesitated, his gaze sweeping across the room, as if searching for the right words, the right way to explain the unexplainable. He walked over to the table and sat down, his movements slow and deliberate. Emmy sat down across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I used to ride with a different kind of crowd," he began, his voice low and hesitant. Men who lived outside the law. We weren't good men. Emmy felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She'd suspected as much, had sensed the darkness that surrounded him, but hearing it confirmed, hearing him admit to a past life of lawlessness, sent a shiver of fear through her. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a deep sadness, a regret that seemed to cut him to the core. "Things I'm not proud of," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "Things I can't take back. We robbed banks, trains hurt people. It was a wild time. A different life." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the window, as if he could see the ghosts of his past swirling in the darkness outside. "I thought I could leave it all behind," he continued, his voice filled with a bitter irony. "Start over. Find some peace. But the past, it has a way of catching up with you, no matter how far you run." Emmy listened, her heart aching for him, for the pain he so clearly carried. She knew about running, about trying to escape the ghosts of the past. She'd been doing it for years, ever since Thomas had died, ever since she'd been left alone to face the challenges of the ranch. "What happened?" she asked, her voice gentle. "What made you change?" He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to understand, to offer him any kind of compassion. He'd expected judgment, condemnation, the same reactions he'd received from everyone else. "A woman," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She believed in me, saw something good in me, even when I didn't see it myself. She gave me a reason to want to be better." Emmy felt a pang of something she hadn't experienced in years: jealousy. A sharp, unexpected stab of envy for the woman who had touched this man's heart, who had inspired him to change. "What happened to her?" she asked, the words catching in her throat. He closed his eyes, his face contorted with pain. "She's gone," he said, his voice barely a whisper.
"Killed. By the same men I used to ride with."
They blamed me for leaving. They wanted revenge." Emmy gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She couldn't imagine the pain he must have endured, the guilt he must carry. Losing Thomas had been devastating, but to lose someone to violence, to the very life you'd tried to escape, it was unimaginable. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice filled with genuine compassion. He opened his eyes, looking at her with a gratitude that surprised her. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice regaining some of its strength. "But it never really leaves you." The sound of horses approaching broke the silence. Jed and the other men were returning. Emmy stood up, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She didn't know what they'd found, what kind of trouble they'd encountered, but she knew one thing for sure. Garrett Landry's past had just caught up with him, and it had landed squarely on her doorstep. Jed burst through the door, his face grim, his clothes covered in dust. Billy and Silas followed close behind, their expressions equally somber. "Rustlers," Jed said, his voice harsh. "Tried to make off with a dozen head. We managed to stop them, but they got away." Emmy let out a sigh of relief. It could have been worse. Losing a few head of cattle was a setback, but it wasn't a catastrophe. "Anyone hurt?" she asked, her gaze scanning their faces for any sign of injury.
"No," Jed replied.
"We were lucky." He looked at Garrett, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You know anything about this, Landry?" he asked, his voice accusing. Garrett met his gaze, unflinching. "No," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I don't." Jed didn't look convinced. He'd never trusted Garrett, and this incident had only confirmed his suspicions. "I'm going to bed," Emmy suddenly announced, interrupting the brewing confrontation. She was tired, emotionally drained. She needed time to process everything she'd learned, to decide what to do about Garrett Landry and the trouble he'd brought with him. "Jed, make sure everything's secure. We'll deal with this in the morning." She walked past them, her steps heavy, her mind racing. As she reached the door, she paused, looking back at Garrett. He was watching her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something that looked like hope. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. "For believing me." Emmy just looked at him, and went up the old, creaking stairs, a heavy saddle of doubt resting squarely on her shoulders, its weight both familiar and strange. Chapter 5. Beneath a sky of endless stars. Sleep evaded Emmy. The events of the evening replayed in her mind, a carousel of worry and uncertainty. Garrett's confession, the gunshots, Jed's suspicion, it all swirled within her, a tempest threatening to capsize the fragile peace she'd cultivated over the past 5 years. She tossed and turned, the rough linen sheets scratching against her skin, the silence of the house amplifying the turmoil within her. Finally, she gave up. Throwing back the covers, she rose from the bed and walked over to the window. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the ranch, illuminating the landscape in a soft, ethereal light. The vastness of the sky, the endless expanse of stars, always had a calming effect on her. It was a reminder of something larger than herself, something timeless and enduring. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, the cool night air raising goosebumps on her arms. She slipped out of the house, the wooden floorboards creaking softly beneath her feet, and stepped onto the porch. The silence of the night enveloped her, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote and the gentle rustling of the wind through the dry grass. She sat down on the porch swing, the chains groaning softly as she moved. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath of the cool, clean air, letting the peace of the night seep into her soul. She needed to think, to sort through her feelings, to decide what to do. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, lost in thought, but eventually, she became aware of a presence beside her. She opened her eyes and saw Garrett standing at the edge of the porch, his silhouette outlined against the moonlit sky. He was leaning against one of the support posts, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the stars. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, her voice soft, breaking the silence. He turned his head, his blue eyes reflecting the moonlight. "No," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "Too much on my mind." Emmy nodded, understanding. She knew what it was like to be haunted by the past, to be kept awake by regrets and worries. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat down on the swing beside her. The chains groaned again, a familiar sound that somehow comforted her. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, the vastness of the night sky stretching above them. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper, "for bringing trouble to your doorstep." Emmy turned to look at him, her gaze searching his face. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine remorse that he carried. "It's not your fault," she said, her voice gentle. "Trouble has a way of finding us, whether we're looking for it or not." He nodded, his gaze drifting back to the stars. "I keep hoping, I keep thinking I can outrun it," he said, his voice filled with a bitter irony. "But it always catches up." "Maybe you don't have to outrun it," Emmy said, her voice thoughtful. "Maybe you just have to face it." He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Face it?" he repeated, the words sounding foreign to him. "Yes," Emmy replied, her voice firm. "You can't change the past, Garrett. But you can choose how you live in the present. You can choose to be a better man, to make amends for your mistakes." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on hers. She saw the struggle in his eyes, the war between his past and his present, between the darkness that haunted him and the flicker of hope that she'd seen in him. "It's not that easy," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "No," Emmy agreed. "It's not. But it's the only way to find peace." She reached out and placed her hand on his, her fingers covering his calloused, weathered hand. It was a simple gesture, a gesture of comfort, of understanding, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. She felt a connection to him, a shared understanding of pain and loss, of the struggle to survive in a harsh and unforgiving world. He turned his hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. His grip was firm, warm, and she felt a strange sense of safety settle over her. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, a feeling she'd almost forgotten. They sat there, their hands clasped together, beneath the vast, star-studded sky. The silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken words, but filled with a quiet understanding, a shared sense of hope. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice soft, "for seeing something good in me." Emmy smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "It's there, Garrett," she said. "You just have to let it shine." She squeezed his hand and felt the warm answering pressure. She felt the cool night around them, and the endless stars seemed to twinkle just a little bit brighter, just for them, in the vast, dark sky. A coyote howled far away, and Emmy felt, oddly, like answering. Chapter 6. The Price of Trust in a Lawless Land. The morning dawned crisp and clear, the sky a brilliant blue, the air still holding the chill of the night. Emmy was up before sunrise, as usual, her internal clock attuned to the rhythms of the ranch. She made coffee, the strong, dark brew filling the kitchen with its familiar aroma, and started breakfast, frying bacon and eggs, the sizzle and pop a comforting soundtrack to the early morning quiet. She found herself thinking about Garrett, about the conversation they'd shared under the stars. His vulnerability, his willingness to confront his past, had touched her deeply. She'd seen a glimpse of the man he could be, the man he wanted to be, and it had stirred something within her, a flicker of hope, a yearning for something more than the solitary existence she'd grown accustomed to. But she also knew that trust was a precious commodity in this land, a commodity that was often bought and sold with blood. She couldn't afford to be naive, to let her emotions cloud her judgment. She had a ranch to run, a responsibility to her men, and she couldn't risk everything on a man with a troubled past, no matter how compelling his blue eyes might be. The men arrived for breakfast, their faces etched with the weariness of a restless night. Jed was particularly subdued, his gaze lingering on Garrett with a mixture of suspicion and resentment. He hadn't forgotten the gunshots, the rustlers, and he clearly blamed Garrett for bringing trouble to Sundown Ranch. "We need to increase patrols," Jed said, his voice gruff, as he sat down at the table. "And I want someone watching Landry at all times. I don't trust him." Emmy sighed. She understood Jed's concerns, but she also felt a surge of protectiveness towards Garrett. She didn't believe he was involved in the rustling, but she knew it would be difficult to convince Jed of that. "He's just one man," Emmy said, trying to keep her voice calm and reasonable. "He can't be responsible for every bad thing that happens in this territory." "He's got a past," Jed retorted, his eyes narrowed. "A past that smells like trouble. I've seen his kind before. They don't change." "Everyone deserves a second chance," Emmy said, her voice firm. She met Jed's gaze, unflinching. She wouldn't back down, not on this. She'd made a decision to give Garrett a chance, and she wasn't going to let Jed's prejudice change her mind. Garrett, who had been silent until now, spoke up, his voice low and even. "I understand your concerns, Jed," he said, "and I respect them. But I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just looking for a chance to start over." Jed grunted, unconvinced. "We'll see," he muttered, turning his attention to his breakfast. The meal was a tense affair, the silence broken only by the clinking of forks and spoons. Emmy felt the weight of Jed's disapproval, the unspoken tension between him and Garrett, and it made her uneasy. She knew that this situation could easily escalate, could lead to a confrontation that would threaten the fragile peace of the ranch. After breakfast, Emmy assigned the men their tasks for the day, deliberately pairing Garrett with Billy, the youngest and most open-minded of the three. She hoped that Billy's easygoing nature would help to ease the tension, to give Garrett a chance to prove himself. She spent the morning working in the corral, mending fences, and tending to the horses. She found that her thoughts kept returning to Garrett, to the vulnerability she'd seen in him, the yearning for redemption that had touched her heart. She wondered about the woman he'd lost, the woman who had believed in him, and she felt a pang of something. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly, but a sense of longing. A longing for a connection, a companionship that she hadn't realized she'd been missing. In the afternoon, she rode out to check on the cattle, her rifle strapped to her saddle, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. The vastness of the land, the endless sky, always had a way of putting things in perspective. It reminded her of her own insignificance, of the fleeting nature of life, and it made her question her own choices, her own fears. She found Garrett and Billy near Sundown Creek, watering the cattle. They were working together seamlessly, their movements coordinated, their conversation easy and relaxed. Billy was laughing at something Garrett had said, and Emmy felt a warmth spread through her. She saw the genuine smile on Garrett's face, the lightness in his eyes, and it reassured her. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a place here, a home, a sense of belonging. As she rode closer, Garrett looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes, and Emmy felt her heart skip a beat. It was a smile that held no secrets, no shadows, just a simple, honest appreciation. "Everything all right, Mrs. Sullivan?" he asked, his voice a low drawl that sent a shiver down her spine. "Just checking in," Emmy replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "How's it going?" "Good," he said, nodding towards Billy. "Billy's a good hand. He's teaching me the ropes." Billy grinned, his face flushed with pride. "He's a fast learner, Mrs. Sullivan," he said. "He's got a natural way with the animals." Emmy smiled, pleased. She was glad to see Garrett fitting in, making an effort to earn the trust of her men. It wasn't going to be easy, she knew, but it was a start. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Emmy rode back to the ranch house, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She knew that the road ahead would be challenging, that the price of trust in this lawless land was high, but she was willing to pay it. She'd seen something in Garrett Landry, something that had awakened a part of her she thought had long since died, and she wasn't going to let it go without a fight. Back at the house, she glanced to the porch, and he sat there on that swing where they had talked the night before. But this time, he wasn't looking at the sky. Instead, he was looking at her. Chapter 7. Whispers carried on the desert wind. The next few days settled into a fragile routine. Garrett worked hard, proving himself to be a capable and reliable hand. He was quick to learn, strong, and had a natural way with the animals, just as Billy had said. He even managed to crack a few smiles out of Silas, the quiet, stoic ranch hand, a feat Emmy hadn't witnessed in the years Silas had worked for her. But Jed remained a constant source of tension. He watched Garrett with unwavering suspicion, his eyes narrowed, his mouth set in a grim line. He never missed an opportunity to remind Emmy of Garrett's past, of the danger he posed to the ranch. Emmy understood Jed's concerns, but she was growing increasingly frustrated with his stubborn refusal to give Garrett a chance. One evening, after a long day of mending fences, Emmy found herself alone with Jed on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, and a cool breeze rustled through the dry grass. "He's working out, Jed," Emmy said, her voice calm but firm. "He's a good hand. He's pulling his weight." Jed grunted, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "He's waiting for his chance," he said, his voice gruff. "Waiting to betray us. I can feel it." "That's not fair, Jed," Emmy said, her voice rising slightly. "You're judging him based on his past, not on who he is now." "His past is who he is, Emmy," Jed retorted, turning to look at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and frustration. "You're being naive. You're letting your feelings cloud your judgment." Emmy felt a flush creep up her cheeks. She knew what Jed was implying, and it angered her. She wasn't blind to Garrett's attractiveness, to the way he made her feel, but she wasn't a foolish schoolgirl, swayed by a handsome face and a pair of blue eyes. "My feelings have nothing to do with it," she said, her voice sharp. "I'm running a ranch, Jed. I need good hands, and Garrett is a good hand. That's all there is to it." Jed sighed, his shoulders slumping. He knew he was fighting a losing battle. He'd known Emmy her whole life, had watched her grow into a strong, independent woman, and he knew that once she'd made up her mind, there was no changing it. "Just be careful, Emmy," he said, his voice softer now. "Please. I don't want to see you get hurt." Emmy nodded, her anger fading. She knew Jed's concern came from a place of loyalty, of protectiveness. He'd been like a father figure to her, especially after her own father had passed, and she valued his opinion, even if she didn't always agree with it. "I will, Jed," she said, her voice gentle. "I promise." The conversation left her feeling uneasy, though. Jed's words, his warning, had planted a seed of doubt in her mind. She tried to push it away, to focus on the positive, on the progress Garrett was making, but it lingered, a nagging worry that she couldn't quite shake. Later that evening, as she was preparing supper, she heard a knock on the door. She opened it to find Garrett standing there, his hat in his hand, his face etched with concern. "Can I talk to you, Mrs. Sullivan?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant. "Of course," Emmy replied, stepping aside to let him in. He entered the kitchen, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the familiar surroundings. He seemed nervous, uneasy, and Emmy felt a pang of sympathy for him. He was trying so hard to fit in, to prove himself, but he was constantly battling the weight of his past, the suspicion of others. "What is it, Garrett?" she asked, her voice gentle. He hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I overheard you and Jed talking," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He doesn't trust me." Emmy sighed. She'd hoped he hadn't heard their conversation, but she knew it was inevitable. The walls of the ranch house were thin, and secrets were hard to keep in such close quarters. "He's protective of me," Emmy said, choosing her words carefully. "He's known me a long time. He's just worried." "He thinks I'm going to hurt you," Garrett said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and pain. "He thinks I'm going to betray you." "He doesn't know you, Garrett," Emmy said, her voice firm. "He doesn't know the man you are now." He looked at her, his blue eyes searching hers. "Do you know me, Mrs. Sullivan?" he asked, his voice soft. "Do you trust me?" Emmy met his gaze, unflinching. She thought about the conversations they'd shared, the vulnerability he'd shown her, the glimpse she'd seen of the good man beneath the hardened exterior. She thought about the way he made her feel, the sense of hope he'd awakened within her. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I trust you, Garrett." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. A faint smile touched his lips, a smile of relief, of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. That means more to me than you know." Emmy smiled back, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. She felt a connection to him, a bond of trust that had been forged in the crucible of hardship and shared vulnerability. It was a fragile bond, she knew, but it was there, and it was growing stronger with each passing day. As they stood there, looking at each other, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the faint sound of something. It was a distant rumble, a low growl that sent a shiver down Emmy's spine. It was a sound she hadn't heard in years, a sound that brought back a flood of memories, a wave of fear. "What is that?" Garrett asked, his eyes narrowed, his body tense. Emmy listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that sound. She'd heard it before, years ago, when she was a young girl, when her father had been fighting to protect their land from them. "It's a cattle stampede," she whispered, her voice trembling. And the sound was growing louder. Chapter 8. Scars that run deeper than the skin. The rumble grew into a roar, shaking the very foundations of the ranch house. Emmy's blood ran cold. A stampede, especially at night, was a rancher's worst nightmare. It meant chaos, destruction, and potential death, not only for the cattle but for anyone caught in their path. "Stay here," Garrett ordered, his voice sharp, his demeanor instantly transformed. Gone was the hesitant, almost apologetic man seeking redemption. In his place stood a seasoned frontiersman, alert, decisive, and ready for action. He grabbed his hat and was out the door before Emmy could even protest. She followed him outside, her heart pounding in her chest. The sight that greeted her was terrifying. A dark, surging mass of cattle, hundreds of them, were thundering across the open range, their hooves pounding the earth, their bellows echoing in the night. The air was thick with dust, illuminated by the pale moonlight, creating an almost apocalyptic scene. Jed, Billy, and Silas were already on horseback, trying to turn the herd, to divert them away from the ranch buildings and the fences. But it was a futile effort. The cattle were panicked, driven by some unknown fear, and they were unstoppable. What caused it? Emmy shouted to Jed as he rode past, his face grim, his eyes focused on the chaotic scene. "Don't know," he yelled back, his voice strained.
Sophie Sporkity. Could be anything.
Emmy scanned the horizon, her eyes searching for any sign of what might have triggered the stampede. A lightning strike? A pack of wolves? Or something more sinister? She saw Garrett riding towards the front of the herd, his horse a dark blur against the moonlit landscape. He was riding with a skill and confidence that surprised her, his body moving in perfect harmony with the animal, his movements fluid and graceful. He was a natural horseman, she realized, born to the saddle. He was also riding straight into danger.
Garrett!
She screamed, her voice lost in the roar of the stampede.
Get back!
But he didn't hear her, or if he did, he ignored her. He was focused on the task at hand, on trying to control the chaos, to protect the ranch, her ranch. Emmy watched, her heart in her throat, as he rode alongside the surging mass of cattle, his voice shouting commands, his rope whipping through the air. He was trying to turn the lead steers, to divert them away from the fences, but it was a losing battle. The sheer force of the stampede was overwhelming. Suddenly, a section of fence gave way, the wooden posts snapping like twigs under the pressure of the thundering hooves. Cattle poured through the gap, heading straight for the barn, the corral, the heart of the ranch. Emmy knew she had to do something. She couldn't just stand there and watch her livelihood, her home, be destroyed. She ran towards the stable, her boots pounding on the hard ground, her lungs burning. She grabbed her own horse, a sturdy mare named Belle, and saddled her quickly, her hands trembling. She mounted Belle and rode out into the chaos, her rifle strapped to her back, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She had to help, to do whatever she could to save the ranch. She saw Garrett again, still fighting to control the herd. He'd managed to turn a small group of cattle, but the main body of the stampede was still raging out of control. He looked exhausted, his clothes covered in dust, his face streaked with sweat, but he didn't give up. As she rode closer, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A group of riders, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, were approaching from the east. They were riding fast, their guns drawn, and they were heading straight for Garrett. Rustlers. It all became clear. The stampede hadn't been an accident. It had been deliberately orchestrated, a diversion to allow the rustlers to steal cattle under the cover of darkness and chaos. And Garrett, in his attempt to save the ranch, had ridden right into their trap. Emmy knew she had to warn him. She spurred Belle forward, her rifle in her hand, her heart pounding with a desperate urgency.
Garrett!
She screamed, her voice hoarse. Behind you! He turned, his eyes widening as he saw the approaching riders. He reached for his gun, but it was too late. A shot rang out, and Emmy saw him slump in the saddle, his body jerking violently.
No!
She screamed, her voice filled with anguish. She fired her rifle, aiming at the rustlers, but they were too far away. Her shots went wild, lost in the chaos of the stampede. Belle reared, startled by the gunfire, and Emmy struggled to control her. She saw Garrett's horse bolt, riderless, disappearing into the dust and the darkness. She saw the rustlers ride past, their faces hidden by bandanas, their laughter echoing in the night. And then, she saw nothing but dust, and heard nothing but the thunder of hooves and the pounding of her own broken heart. Her vision tunneled, blurred, focused only on the spot where she'd last seen him. The scars of her life, old and new, seemed to tear open, raw and bleeding, mirroring the wounds she feared Garrett now bore. Chapter 9. A dance of defiance and desire. The stampede slowly subsided, the thunder of hooves fading into a distant rumble, then silence. The dust settled, revealing the devastation, broken fences, trampled ground, scattered cattle, and an aching emptiness where Garrett had been. Emmy searched frantically, her heart pounding with a desperate fear. She called his name, her voice hoarse, her throat raw, but there was no answer. Only the whisper of the wind, carrying with it the scent of dust and the bitter taste of loss. Jed, Billy, and Silas rode up, their faces grim, their horses exhausted. They'd managed to turn the majority of the herd, preventing a complete catastrophe, but the damage was done. "Where is he?" Emmy asked, her voice trembling, her eyes desperately searching their faces. "Where's Garrett?" Jed shook his head, his expression somber. "We don't know," he said, his voice heavy.
He was shot.
"We saw him go down." Emmy felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She swayed in the saddle, her vision blurring. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "Garrett shot.
Gone."
"We have to find him," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with a steely determination. "We have to." They searched for hours, their lanterns casting eerie shadows across the ravaged landscape. They followed the trail of the stampede, the tracks of the rustlers, calling Garrett's name, hoping against hope for a response. But there was nothing, only silence. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of pink and orange, they finally found him. He was lying near a small, rocky outcrop, his body crumpled, his clothes soaked in blood. Emmy slid off her horse, her legs barely able to support her. She rushed to his side, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and a fragile, desperate hope. He was alive.
Barely.
He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged, his face pale and drawn. There was a bullet wound in his shoulder, the blood still flowing, staining the ground beneath him. "We need to get him back to the house," Emmy said, her voice trembling but firm. "Jed, help me lift him." They carefully lifted Garrett onto Jed's horse, Emmy supporting his head, her hands covered in his blood. They rode slowly back to the ranch house, their hearts heavy with worry, their hopes hanging by a thread. They laid him on the bed in the spare room, the same room where he'd slept when he first arrived at Sundown Ranch. Emmy cut away his shirt, exposing the wound. It was deep, ugly, and still bleeding profusely. She worked quickly, efficiently, her hands moving with a practiced skill honed by years of tending to injured animals and the occasional wounded ranch hand. She cleaned the wound, packed it with clean cloths, and bandaged it tightly, trying to stem the flow of blood. She didn't know if it would be enough. He'd lost a lot of blood, and he was weak, his life hanging precariously in the balance. She sat beside him, holding his hand, her eyes fixed on his face. She watched his chest rise and fall with each shallow breath, listening to the faint beat of his heart, willing him to live. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in a haze of worry and exhaustion. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting its warm rays through the window, illuminating the room in a soft, golden light. Finally, he stirred. His eyelids fluttered, and he groaned softly. Emmy leaned closer, her heart leaping with hope. "Garrett?" she whispered, her voice trembling.
"Can you hear me?"
His eyes opened slowly, his blue eyes clouded with pain and confusion. He looked at her, his gaze unfocused, then recognition dawned in his eyes. "Emmy?" he whispered, his voice weak and raspy. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm here. You're safe." He tried to smile, but it turned into a grimace of pain. "Rustlers," he whispered. "They shot me." "I know," Emmy said, her voice gentle. "You're hurt, but you're going to be all right. I've taken care of the wound." He closed his eyes, his breathing still shallow and ragged. He seemed to drift in and out of consciousness, his grip on her hand weakening, then tightening again. Emmy stayed with him, watching over him, tending to his needs. She bathed his forehead with cool water, gave him sips of water when he was conscious, and spoke to him softly, reassuringly, even when he couldn't hear her. As the day wore on, he seemed to stabilize. His breathing became a little easier, his color a little better. The bleeding had stopped, and the fever that had gripped him seemed to be subsiding. In the evening, as the sun began to set, he opened his eyes again, his gaze clearer, more focused. He looked at Emmy, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something that made her heart skip a beat. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice stronger now, "for saving my life." Emmy smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "You saved the ranch, Garrett," she said, her voice soft. "You risked your life for us." He shook his head slightly. "I owed you," he whispered. "You gave me a chance." Emmy felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of connection that went beyond gratitude, beyond obligation. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the genuine goodness that she'd sensed in him from the beginning, and it drew her to him, irresistibly. She leaned closer, her hand gently brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. He looked at her, his blue eyes intense, searching, and Emmy felt a shiver run down her spine. The air between them crackled with an unspoken tension, a dance of defiance and desire, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them, forged in the crucible of danger and shared vulnerability. He lifted a weak hand and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on the soft skin of her neck. Chapter 10. The Unforgiving Truth of Frontier Justice. Garrett's recovery was slow but steady. Emmy tended to him with a devotion that surprised even herself. She changed his bandages, prepared his meals, and sat with him for hours, talking to him, reading to him, or simply holding his hand in comfortable silence. She found herself opening up to him, sharing stories about her life, her childhood, her marriage to Thomas, the joys and sorrows of running Sundown Ranch. He listened patiently, his blue eyes filled with understanding and empathy, offering quiet words of comfort and encouragement. As he regained his strength, Garrett, in turn, shared more about his past, the details of his life before he came to Sundown Ranch. He spoke of his childhood on a small, struggling farm in Texas, his early dreams of becoming a lawman, and the tragic events that had led him down a darker path. He spoke of the woman he'd loved and lost, the guilt and regret he carried, and his yearning for redemption. Emmy listened, her heart aching for him, for the pain he'd endured, the mistakes he'd made. She saw the good man beneath the hardened exterior, the man he was striving to become, and she admired his courage, his resilience, his determination to change his life. The bond between them deepened, strengthened by shared vulnerability and mutual respect. The unspoken attraction that had simmered between them from the beginning grew stronger, a palpable tension that filled the air whenever they were together. They were drawn to each other, irresistibly, like two magnets, their hearts yearning for a connection that went beyond friendship, beyond gratitude. But they were also aware of the obstacles, the complications, that stood in their way. Garrett's past, Jed's continued suspicion, the unforgiving nature of frontier justice, all these factors cast a shadow over their budding relationship, a constant reminder of the risks involved. One afternoon, as Garrett was sitting on the porch, enjoying the warm sunshine, Sheriff Buckley rode up to the ranch house. He was a tall, imposing man, with a stern face and a no-nonsense demeanor. He'd been the sheriff of this territory for as long as Emmy could remember, and he'd always been a fair, if somewhat harsh, enforcer of the law. Emmy greeted him with a mixture of respect and apprehension. She knew he was here about the rustlers, about the stampede, and she suspected he'd have questions for Garrett. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Emmy said, her voice steady. "What brings you out to Sundown?" "Heard about the trouble you had," Sheriff Buckley said, his gaze sweeping across the ranch, taking in the evidence of the recent stampede. "Rustlers, I hear." "Yes," Emmy replied. "They got away with a few head, but it could have been worse." "And I hear one of your men was shot," the sheriff continued, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Garrett. "This him?" "Yes," Emmy said, stepping forward, protectively. "This is Garrett Landry. He was trying to stop the stampede when the rustlers shot him." Sheriff Buckley studied Garrett for a long moment, his gaze intense, scrutinizing. "Landry," he repeated, the name sounding like an accusation. "I've heard that name before." Garrett met his gaze, unflinching. "I used to ride with some men who weren't on the right side of the law," he admitted, his voice calm and steady. "But I left that life behind." "Did you now?" Sheriff Buckley said, his voice skeptical. "And what brings a man like you to Sundown Ranch?" "I was looking for work," Garrett replied. "A chance to start over." The sheriff grunted, unconvinced. "I'll be keeping an eye on you, Landry," he said, his voice harsh. "You cause any trouble, you'll answer to me." He turned to Emmy, his expression softening slightly. "You be careful, Emmy," he said, his voice gentler now. "You've always been a good woman, a law-abiding citizen. Don't let this man drag you down." He's not dragging me down, Sheriff, Emmy said, her voice firm. He saved my ranch. He risked his life for us. The sheriff nodded, his gaze lingering on Emmy for a moment, then on Garrett. He seemed to be weighing his options, considering the situation. All right, he said finally. But I'm warning you, Landry. One wrong move, and you're finished. He turned his horse and rode away, leaving Emmy and Garrett standing on the porch, the air thick with unspoken tension. I'm sorry, Emmy, Garrett said, his voice filled with regret. I'm bringing you nothing but trouble. It's not your fault, Emmy said, her voice gentle. She reached out and touched his arm, her fingers lingering on his skin. You can't help your past. But I can choose my future, he said, his blue eyes intense, searching hers. And I choose you.
If you'll have me.
Emmy felt her heart skip a beat. She looked at him, her gaze locked with his, and she saw the sincerity in his eyes, the love, the longing. She knew the risks, the challenges, but she also knew that she couldn't deny the feelings that had been growing within her, the connection she felt to this man. But before she could answer, a distant gunshot broke them apart, and a rider came fast towards the ranch. It was Billy, and even from a distance, Emmy could see the fear on his face. Something was very, very wrong. Chapter 11. Between the cattle drive and a broken heart. Billy reined in his horse, the animal lathered and panting, its eyes wide with fear. He was covered in dust, his clothes torn, and there was a fresh streak of blood on his sleeve. Mrs. Sullivan. He gasped, his voice trembling. Jed, they got Jed. Emmy felt a jolt of fear, a cold dread that gripped her heart. What happened? She asked, her voice sharp, urgent. Where is he? We were rounding up strays, Billy stammered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Near the North Ridge. Rustlers, they ambushed us. Is he? Emmy couldn't bring herself to say the word, her voice choked with emotion. He's alive, Billy said, his voice shaking. But he's bad hurt. They took him. Said they'd trade him for Landry. Emmy felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She looked at Garrett, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and horror. They want me, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's my fault. No, Emmy said, her voice firm, her eyes flashing with anger. It's not your fault. It's their fault. They're the criminals, not you. But she knew, deep down, that Garrett was right. The rustlers were after him, and they were using Jed, her loyal foreman, her friend, as leverage. She had a terrible choice to make. Hand Garrett over to the rustlers, knowing they would likely kill him, or refuse and risk Jed's life. We have to do something, Billy said, his voice desperate. We can't just leave him there. I know, Emmy said, her mind racing, trying to come up with a plan. She couldn't just hand Garrett over. She wouldn't. But she also couldn't abandon Jed. She had to find another way, a way to save them both. How many were there? Garrett asked, his voice regaining some of its strength, his mind focused on the situation. 5, Billy replied. Maybe 6. I didn't get a good look. Do you know where they took him? Garrett continued. They said they'd be waiting at the old abandoned mine. Billy said, his voice trembling. At Sundown. The old abandoned mine. It was a desolate, dangerous place, a maze of tunnels and shafts, a perfect place for an ambush. Emmy knew that going there would be risky, potentially suicidal, but she also knew that she had no choice. We're going after him, Emmy said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with determination. We're going to get Jed back. Garrett nodded, his expression grim. I'm going with you, he said. No, Emmy said, shaking her head. They want you, Garrett. It's too dangerous. I'm not letting you go alone, he said, his voice unwavering. It's my fault Jed's in this mess. I'm going to help get him out. Emmy looked at him, her gaze searching his face. She saw the determination in his eyes, the courage, the willingness to sacrifice himself for the sake of others. She knew she couldn't stop him, and she wouldn't. All right, she said, her voice heavy with resignation. We go together. But we need a plan. They spent the next few hours strategizing, planning their attack. They knew they were outnumbered, outgunned. But they had the element of surprise on their side. They knew the terrain, the layout of the old mine, and they hoped that would give them an advantage. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, they rode out, Emmy, Garrett, and Billy, their horses' hooves pounding on the hard ground, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. They were riding into danger, into the unknown, but they were riding together, united by a common purpose, to save Jed, to confront the rustlers, to fight for what was right. The abandoned mine was a dark, foreboding place, the entrance a gaping hole in the side of the ridge, the surrounding area littered with rusting equipment and crumbling buildings. The silence was eerie, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the distant caw of a crow. They dismounted a short distance from the mine, tethering their horses in a hidden alcove. They checked their weapons, their faces grim, their eyes alert, ready for anything. "Remember the plan," Emmy whispered, her voice low and urgent. "Billy, you circle around to the back. Garrett and I will go in through the main entrance. We'll try to draw their fire, give you a chance to get to Jed." Billy nodded, his face pale but determined. He slipped away into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness. Emmy and Garrett looked at each other, their eyes meeting, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they faced, the bond that held them together. "Be careful," Emmy whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Garrett nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "You too," he said. They took a deep breath, then stepped into the darkness of the mine, their guns drawn, their hearts pounding, their fates hanging in the balance. The air was cool and damp, and smelled of dirt and decay. Emmy's heart felt like a broken thing, caught between the cattle drive of her emotions and the sharp, painful knowledge that this could all end badly. Chapter 12. The Sheriff's Secret, the Outlaw's Promise. The mine was a labyrinth of twisting tunnels and dark, echoing chambers. Emmy and Garrett moved slowly, cautiously, their senses on high alert. The only light came from the slivers of moonlight that filtered through cracks in the rock and the beam of the single lantern Garrett carried, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on their eyes. "Stay close," Garrett whispered, his voice barely audible above the drip, drip, drip of water echoing through the mine. Emmy nodded, her hand gripping her rifle tightly. She could feel the tension radiating from him, the coiled energy of a man ready to spring into action. She trusted him, she realized. With her life, with Jed's life, with everything. They moved deeper into the mine, the silence broken only by the crunch of their boots on the gravel floor and the occasional scuttling of unseen creatures. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic, acrid, that made Emmy's stomach churn. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the mine, harsh and menacing. "Landry, we know you're in here. Come out, and we'll let the old man go." It was the voice of the rustler leader, Emmy realized. She recognized it from the night of the stampede, the night Garrett had been shot. Garrett stopped, his body tense, his hand tightening on his gun. He looked at Emmy, his eyes questioning. "We stick to the plan," Emmy whispered, her voice firm.
"Get to Jed."
Garrett nodded, his expression grim. He knew the risks, but he also knew that they had no other choice. They moved forward, following the sound of the voice, their steps measured, their senses straining. They rounded a corner and saw them. The rustlers, 5 of them, standing around a makeshift campfire, their guns drawn, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. And Jed, tied to a wooden support post, his head slumped forward, his body bruised and battered. "There he is," one of the rustlers shouted, spotting Garrett. "Get him." Gunfire erupted, the shots echoing through the mine, the bullets ricocheting off the rock walls. Emmy and Garrett dove for cover, finding shelter behind a pile of fallen rocks.
"Stay down,"
Garrett shouted, his voice strained above the din of the gunfire. Emmy peered over the rocks, her rifle ready. She saw the rustlers advancing, their guns blazing, their faces contorted with anger and hatred. "We're pinned down," she shouted to Garrett. "We can't get to Jed." Garrett didn't answer. He was looking past the rustlers, his eyes focused on something in the distance. Emmy followed his gaze and saw Billy. He was sneaking up behind the rustlers, his rifle raised, his face set in a grim mask of determination. He fired, his shot hitting one of the rustlers in the back. The man screamed and fell, his gun clattering to the ground. The other rustlers turned, surprised, their attention momentarily diverted. It was the opportunity Garrett had been waiting for. He rose from his cover, his gun blazing, his movements swift and decisive. He fired again and again, each shot finding its mark. 2 more rustlers fell, their bodies crumpling to the ground. The remaining 2 rustlers, panicked, turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness of the mine. Garrett rushed to Jed's side, cutting the ropes that bound him. Emmy joined them, her heart pounding with relief.
"Jed,"
she cried, her voice choked with emotion. "Are you all right?" Jed groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at Emmy, his gaze unfocused, then recognition dawned in his eyes. "Emmy?" he whispered, his voice weak and raspy. You came." "Of course we came," Emmy said, her voice gentle. "We wouldn't leave you." They helped Jed to his feet, his legs shaky, his body bruised and battered. He leaned on Garrett for support, his gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something that looked like respect. As they were making their way out of the mine, they heard a shout from behind them. "Hold it right there." They turned and saw Sheriff Buckley standing at the entrance of the mine, his gun drawn, his face stern. Several deputies were with him, their rifles aimed at Garrett, Emmy, and Jed. "What's the meaning of this, Sheriff?" Emmy asked, her voice confused and apprehensive. "I might ask you the same question," Sheriff Buckley replied, his gaze fixed on Garrett. "I told you to stay out of trouble, Landry. And here you are, mixed up in a gunfight with rustlers." "They kidnapped Jed," Emmy explained, her voice urgent. "We had to rescue him." "So, you took the law into your own hands?" Sheriff Buckley said, his voice harsh. "That's not how it works in my territory." He turned to his deputies. "Arrest him," he said, nodding towards Garrett. "He's going to jail." Emmy stepped forward, her eyes flashing with anger. "You can't do that," she protested. "He saved Jed's life. He risked his own life to rescue him. He's a wanted man, Emmy," Sheriff Buckley said, his voice softening slightly. "He has a past.
"He's an outlaw."
"He's not an outlaw anymore," Emmy cried. "He's changed. He's a good man." Sheriff Buckley hesitated, his gaze flickering between Emmy and Garrett. He seemed to be struggling with something, his face etched with conflict. Then he did something that shocked everyone. He lowered his gun. "All right," he said, his voice low and heavy.
"I'll let him go.
But on one condition." He looked at Garrett, his gaze intense. "You leave this territory, Landry," he said. "You leave and you never come back. That's the only way you'll stay out of jail." Garrett looked at Emmy, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of regret and love. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't stay, not anymore. He'd brought too much trouble to Sundown Ranch, to Emmy. "All right, Sheriff," he said, his voice firm. "I'll leave." He made a promise, his eyes locked on Emmy's as the sheriff spoke, a promise he knew he would never be able to keep. Chapter 13. When the past comes calling with a loaded gun. The next morning was heavy with a somber silence. The events of the previous night had left a palpable tension in the air, a sense of loss and impending farewell. Garrett was packing his meager belongings, his movements slow and deliberate, his face etched with a sadness that mirrored Emmy's own. She watched him from the doorway of the bunkhouse, her heart aching, her mind struggling to accept the reality of his departure. She'd known it was coming, had understood the sheriff's ultimatum, but it didn't make it any easier. She'd grown accustomed to his presence, to his quiet strength, to the way he made her feel alive. "You don't have to do this, Garrett," she said, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the silence. He looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. He saw the pain in her eyes, the unspoken plea, and it tore at his heart. "I do," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's the only way to keep you safe, to keep the ranch safe. I can't risk bringing any more trouble to your doorstep." But it's not your fault, Emmy protested, her voice rising slightly. You didn't ask for any of this. It's your past, it's not who you are now. My past is a part of me, Emmy, he said, his voice gentle but firm. It always will be. And it will always follow me. I can't escape it. He finished packing, closing his saddlebags, his movements deliberate, final. He walked over to her, his gaze intense, searching hers. I'll never forget you, Emmy, he said, his voice soft, his hand reaching out to gently touch her cheek. You gave me a chance. You showed me that there's still good in the world. That there's still hope. Emmy felt tears welling up at her eyes, her throat constricting with emotion. She couldn't speak, couldn't find the words to express the depth of her feelings, the pain of losing him. He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that spoke volumes. It was a kiss of goodbye, a kiss of regret, but also a kiss of love. A love that had blossomed in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the frontier, a love that was doomed to be cut short, severed by the cruel realities of their world. He pulled away, his eyes lingering on hers, his hand reluctantly leaving her cheek. He turned and walked out of the bunkhouse, his steps heavy, his shoulders slumped. Emmy watched him go, her heart breaking, tears streaming down her face. She watched him saddle his horse, mount and ride away, disappearing into the vastness of the land, leaving her alone, once again, with the silence and the emptiness. She stood there for a long time, her gaze fixed on the horizon, the dust from his horse's hooves slowly settling, the echoes of his goodbye ringing in her ears. She felt a profound sense of loss, a grief that cut her to the core. She'd lost him, she realized. She'd lost the man she'd come to love, the man who had shown her that even in the darkest of times, there was still hope, still the possibility of happiness. But as she stood there, amidst the ruins of her hopes, she also felt a flicker of something else, defiance.
She wouldn't let this be the end.
She wouldn't let Garrett's past, the sheriff's ultimatum, dictate her future. She would fight for him, for their love, for the chance of a happiness they both deserved. She turned and walked back into the ranch house, her steps determined, her eyes filled with a newfound resolve. She had a ranch to run, a life to live, and she wouldn't let this setback, this heartbreak, defeat her. She went into the kitchen and started preparing breakfast, her movements mechanical, her mind racing. She needed to think, to plan, to figure out a way to bring Garrett back. As she was setting the table, she heard a knock on the door. She opened it and found Sheriff Buckley standing there, his hat in his hand, his face etched with a mixture of concern and something else. Something that looked like guilt. Sheriff, Emmy said, her voice surprised. What brings you back here? I need to talk to you, Emmy, he said, his voice low and hesitant. It's about Landry. Emmy felt a flicker of hope, a spark of anticipation. What about him? She asked, her voice eager. Sheriff Buckley stepped inside, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the familiar surroundings. He seemed uneasy, uncomfortable, and Emmy felt a growing sense of unease. I did some checking, he said, his voice halting. On Landry's past. On the men he used to ride with. He paused, his gaze meeting Emmy's, his eyes filled with a deep sadness, a profound regret. It turns out I was wrong, he said, his voice barely a whisper. About Landry. About everything. He took a deep breath, then continued, his voice stronger now, but filled with a bitter self-reproach. The rustlers who kidnapped Jed, he said. They weren't after Landry. They were after something else. Something they thought he had. He paused again, his gaze drifting towards the window, as if he could see the ghosts of the past swirling in the distance. It turns out Landry's old gang, they weren't just rustlers, he said. They were involved in something much bigger. Something that involved me. Emmy felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't understand, but she knew, instinctively, that what the sheriff was about to reveal would change everything. He looked directly into her eyes and told the rest. The real story. It started years ago. A robbery. A betrayal. And it was a story that implicated him, Sheriff Buckley, right in the center of the tangled web. And it was a story that meant Garrett had been running not from the law, but from a corrupt lawman all along. Chapter 14. A moonlit ride into forbidden territory. Sheriff Buckley's confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Emmy stared at him, her mind reeling, struggling to comprehend the enormity of his words. He, the man who had represented law and order in this territory for as long as she could remember, was corrupt, implicated in the very crimes he was supposed to be fighting. I don't understand, she stammered, her voice trembling. What are you saying? Sheriff Buckley sighed, his shoulders slumping, his face etched with a mixture of guilt and shame. He looked old, suddenly, his years of authority and power stripped away, revealing a broken, flawed man. It was years ago, he began, his voice low and hesitant. Before I became sheriff.
I was a different man then.
Younger, more reckless. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the window, as if he could see the ghosts of his past swirling in the distance. I was involved with a group of men, he continued. We weren't good men. We did things I'm not proud of. He looked at Emmy, his eyes filled with a deep sadness, a profound regret. We robbed a bank, he said, his voice barely a whisper. A bank in Silver Gulch. It was a big haul. A lot of money. Emmy felt a chill run down her spine. Silver Gulch. That was where Garrett's old gang had operated, where he'd met the woman he'd loved, the woman who had been killed. What happened? Emmy asked, her voice barely audible. We got away with it, Sheriff Buckley said. But things went wrong. There was a disagreement. About the money. About how to split it. He paused again, his face contorted with pain. One of the men he betrayed us, he said. He ran off with the money. With everything. And that man was Garrett? Emmy asked, her voice trembling, her heart pounding. Sheriff Buckley shook his head.
No, he said.
It wasn't Landry. It was another man. A man named Silas. Emmy gasped. Silas? Her quiet, stoic ranch hand? The man who'd lost his own ranch to a bank foreclosure? It couldn't be. Silas, he was the one who betrayed you? She asked, her voice incredulous. Sheriff Buckley nodded.
He took the money, he said. And he disappeared.
We never saw him again. Until he showed up here. At your ranch. Emmy felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. It all made sense now. Silas's quiet demeanor, his reluctance to talk about his past, his sudden appearance at Sundown Ranch. He hadn't been looking for work, he'd been hiding. Hiding from Sheriff Buckley, from the other members of his old gang. And Garrett hadn't been running from the law, he'd been running from them. From the men who had killed the woman he loved, the men who were still after the stolen money. But why did they kidnap Jed? Emmy asked, her voice confused. Why did they think Garrett had the money? Because Silas told them, Sheriff Buckley said, his voice filled with a bitter self-reproach. He knew I was looking for him. He knew he was in danger. So he set Landry up. He made it look like Landry was the one who had the money. He used him as a decoy. Emmy felt a surge of anger, a burning rage at Silas's betrayal, at his cruelty. He'd used Garrett, used Jed, used her, all to protect himself, to keep his secret hidden. I have to go after him, she said, her voice firm, her eyes flashing with determination. I have to find Garrett. I have to tell him the truth. Sheriff Buckley nodded. I'll help you, he said, his voice regaining some of its strength. I owe it to Landry. I owe it to you. They left the ranch house, their horses saddled, their rifles ready. They rode out into the vastness of the land, beneath the pale moonlight, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension. They were riding into forbidden territory, into the heart of danger, but they were riding together, united by a common purpose, to find Garrett, to clear his name, to bring Silas to justice. They rode for hours, following Garrett's trail, the tracks of his horse still visible in the soft earth. They knew he was heading south, towards the border, towards Mexico, a place where he hoped to disappear, to start a new life, free from the shadows of his past. As the moon began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape, they saw him. He was camped near a small, dried-up creek bed, his horse grazing nearby, a small fire casting a flickering glow on his face. Emmy felt a surge of relief, a wave of emotion that washed over her. She spurred her horse forward, her heart pounding with anticipation.
Garrett,
she called, her voice echoing in the stillness of the night. He looked up, startled, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. Then he saw her, and his expression changed, his eyes widening with surprise, then relief. He stood up, his gaze fixed on hers, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, confusion, hope, and love. Emmy rode up to him, dismounting, her legs shaky, her heart overflowing. She ran to him, throwing her arms around him, holding him tight, her tears wetting his shirt. She told him everything in a rush. Sheriff Buckley corroborated, had hung in shame. The past, it seemed, was a vast and open plain, and they were all caught in its harsh and unforgiving landscape. Chapter 15. The Cost of Loyalty, the Reward of Love. Garrett listened, stunned, as Emmy and Sheriff Buckley recounted the story of Silas's betrayal, the sheriff's confession, and the truth about the stolen money. He stood there, silhouetted against the dying embers of his campfire, his blue eyes reflecting the flickering flames, his face etched with a mixture of disbelief, anger, and a profound sense of relief. Silas, he whispered, the name a bitter curse on his lips. I should have known. He'd suspected Silas, had sensed something off about the quiet, stoic ranch hand, but he'd never imagined the depth of his deception, the cruelty of his betrayal. He'd been so focused on escaping his own past, on protecting Emmy, that he'd been blind to the danger lurking right under his nose. I'm sorry, Garrett, Sheriff Buckley said, his voice filled with remorse.
I was wrong about you.
I let my past cloud my judgment. I should have known better. Garrett looked at the sheriff, his gaze hard, unforgiving. He'd spent years running, hiding, carrying the burden of a guilt that wasn't his, and it had cost him dearly. It had cost him the woman he loved, his freedom, his peace of mind. But he also saw the genuine remorse in the sheriff's eyes, the weight of his own guilt, and he knew that holding onto anger, onto hatred, wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't bring back the past, it wouldn't heal the wounds. It's done, Garrett said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It's over. He turned to Emmy, his gaze softening, his eyes filled with a love that had endured the trials, the hardships, the betrayals. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her. What do we do now? Emmy asked, her voice soft, her gaze searching his. We go back, Garrett said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with determination. We go back and we clear my name. We bring Silas to justice. Sheriff Buckley nodded.
I'll help you, he said.
I'll testify. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. They rode back to Sundown Ranch, their hearts filled with a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to confront the past, to reclaim their future. They arrived at dawn, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange, the air still holding the chill of the night. They found the ranch in chaos. The bunkhouse was empty, the horses gone, and the main house showed signs of a struggle. Overturned furniture, broken windows, shattered glass. Silas, Garrett muttered, his voice grim. He knew we were coming. He's made his move. They searched the house, their hearts pounding with fear and apprehension. They found Billy tied up in the pantry, gagged and bruised, but alive. He took them, Billy stammered, his voice trembling as Emmy untied him. Silas he took for the cattle. And he took Jed. Emmy felt a surge of anger, a burning rage at Silas's continued cruelty. He'd not only betrayed them, stolen from them, but he'd also taken Jed, her loyal foreman, her friend, hostage once again. Which way did they go? Garrett asked, his voice sharp, urgent. North, Billy replied. Towards the canyon pass. The canyon pass. It was a narrow, treacherous route, a perfect place for an ambush. Silas was leading them into a trap, Emmy realized. He was desperate, cornered, and he would stop at nothing to escape. We have to go after them, Emmy said, her voice firm, her eyes flashing with determination. We have to save Jed. It's too dangerous, Emmy, Garrett said, his voice concerned. It's a trap. We're outnumbered, outgunned. I don't care, Emmy said, her voice unwavering. I'm not losing Jed again. I'm not losing anyone else. She looked at Garrett, her gaze intense, her eyes filled with a love that defied fear, that transcended danger. She knew the risks, she understood the potential consequences, but she wouldn't back down. She wouldn't let Silas win. Garrett saw the determination in her eyes, the fire in her soul, and he knew he couldn't stop her. He wouldn't. He loved her for her courage, her loyalty, her unwavering spirit. All right, he said, his voice firm, his eyes meeting hers. We go together. We face him together. Sheriff Buckley nodded. I'm with you, he said. I'll do whatever I can to help. They gathered what weapons they could find, saddled fresh horses, and rode out, following the trail of the stolen cattle, towards the canyon pass, towards a confrontation that would determine their fate, their future, their love. They rode for Jed, for each other, and for Sundown. The cost of loyalty was high, but the reward of love was immeasurable. Chapter 16. Trapped between a lie and a longing. The canyon pass was a narrow, winding gorge, its steep walls rising hundreds of feet on either side, casting long, ominous shadows. The air was still and heavy, the silence broken only by the crunch of their horses' hooves on the rocky ground and the occasional caw of a raven circling overhead. It was a perfect place for an ambush, Emmy knew, and her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anticipation. They rode cautiously, their senses on high alert, their rifles ready. Garrett rode in the lead, his eyes scanning the terrain, searching for any sign of Silas, of Jed, of the stolen cattle. Emmy rode close behind, her gaze fixed on Garrett's back, her trust in him unwavering. Sheriff Buckley followed, his face grim, his own rifle at the ready. As they rounded a bend in the canyon, they saw them. Silas and his men, 3 of them, were positioned on a rocky ledge overlooking the pass, their rifles trained on the narrow trail below. Jed was tied to a nearby boulder, his head slumped forward, his body bruised and battered. The stolen cattle were milling nervously in a small, enclosed area nearby. Hold it right there, Silas shouted, his voice echoing through the canyon. One more step, and the old man dies. Garrett reined in his horse, his body tense, his hand tightening on his rifle. Emmy and Sheriff Buckley followed suit, their horses stopping abruptly, their eyes fixed on the scene above. Let him go, Silas, Garrett said, his voice calm but firm. It's over. We know the truth. Silas laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that sent a shiver down Emmy's spine. The truth? He sneered. You don't know anything about the truth, Landry. You're just a pawn, a fool, like all the rest. The sheriff knows, Garrett said, his gaze unwavering. He knows about the bank robbery, about the stolen money, about your betrayal. Silas's eyes flickered towards Sheriff Buckley, his expression momentarily shifting from arrogance to fear. But it was fleeting. He quickly regained his composure, his face hardening into a mask of defiance. The sheriff's a liar, Silas said, his voice sharp. He's trying to save his own skin. He's the one who's behind all this. Don't listen to him, Garrett, Sheriff Buckley said, his voice urgent. He's lying. I confessed. I told Emmy everything. He's trying to confuse you, Landry, Silas said, his voice smooth, persuasive. He's trying to turn you against me. We're partners, remember? We're in this together. Garrett hesitated, his gaze flickering between Silas and Sheriff Buckley. He was trapped, Emmy realized, caught between a lie and a longing. A lie that Silas was spinning, a web of deceit designed to save himself, and a longing for the truth, for redemption, for a chance to finally escape the shadows of his past. Don't do it, Garrett, Emmy pleaded, her voice soft but urgent. Don't believe him. He's using you. Garrett looked at Emmy, his blue eyes searching hers. He saw the love in her eyes, the trust, the unwavering belief in him, and it gave him strength. It gave him the courage to make the right choice, to break free from the lies, to embrace the truth. "It's over, Silas," Garrett said, his voice firm, his eyes locking with Silas's. "I know who you are. I know what you've done. And I'm not going to let you get away with it." Silas's face contorted with rage. "You fool," he shouted. "You've chosen the wrong side. You'll regret this." He raised his rifle, aiming it at Garrett. Emmy gasped, her hand flying to her own rifle. But before she could react, a shot rang out. It wasn't from Silas's rifle. It was from Sheriff Buckley. The bullet struck Silas in the chest, knocking him backward, his rifle flying from his grasp. He crumpled to the ground, his body limp, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. The other two wrestlers, stunned by the sudden turn of events, hesitated for a moment, then dropped their weapons, their hands raised in surrender. Garrett and Emmy rushed to Jed's side, cutting the ropes that bound him. He was weak, bruised, but alive. "Emmy?" he whispered, his voice raspy.
"Garrett? You saved me."
"We did," Emmy said, her voice choked with emotion, tears streaming down her face.
"We did."
Sheriff Buckley approached, his face etched with a mixture of relief and sadness. He'd done the right thing, Emmy realized, but it had come at a cost. He'd killed a man he'd once considered a friend, a partner in crime. He'd broken the law to uphold the law, and he would have to face the consequences. He looked truly remorseful, an old and broken man at last. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon, they rode back to Sundown Ranch, their hearts heavy, but their spirits lifted. They'd faced danger, betrayal, and death, but they'd emerged victorious. They'd saved Jed, cleared Garrett's name, and brought Silas to justice. They were free. Chapter 17. The storm breaks over Sundown Ranch. The days following the confrontation at the Canyon Pass were filled with a quiet sense of peace, a fragile calm that settled over Sundown Ranch. Jed was recovering, his wounds healing, his spirit slowly mending. Sheriff Buckley had turned himself in, confessing his past crimes, accepting the consequences of his actions with a quiet dignity that surprised even Emmy. The stolen cattle had been recovered, the remaining rustlers were in jail, and Garrett's name had been cleared, his reputation restored. But despite the outward calm, Emmy felt a lingering unease, a sense of anticipation, as if a storm were brewing on the horizon. She knew that Garrett's past, though no longer a legal threat, still cast a shadow over their future. She knew that his decision to leave, to protect her and the ranch, still hung between them, an unspoken question that needed to be answered. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, Emmy decided to confront the issue, to break the silence that had been growing between them. "What are you going to do now, Garrett?" she asked, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He turned to look at her, his blue eyes meeting hers. He saw the concern in her eyes, the unspoken question, and he knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. "I don't know," he said, his voice honest, his expression uncertain. "I haven't thought that far ahead." "You can't stay here," Emmy said, her voice trembling slightly, her heart aching at the thought of him leaving again. "Not after everything that's happened." "I know," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I don't want to leave."
Not you."
Emmy felt a surge of hope, a flicker of warmth that spread through her. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, her touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. "Then don't," she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a love that defied fear, that transcended doubt. "Stay here, Garrett. Stay with me." He looked at her, his blue eyes searching hers. He saw the sincerity in her eyes, the unwavering love, the invitation, and it filled him with a longing, a yearning for a future he'd never dared to dream of. "But your ranch," he said, his voice hesitant. "Your men. They still don't trust me." "They will," Emmy said, her voice confident.
"They've seen what you've done, Garrett."
"They've seen your courage, your loyalty. They'll come around."
"And you?"
he asked, his voice soft, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Emmy smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, a smile that held no doubts, no reservations. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'm sure. I love you, Garrett Landry.
And I want you to stay.
Here. With me. On Sundown Ranch." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight, his heart overflowing with a love that had endured the trials, the hardships, the betrayals. He kissed her, a passionate kiss that sealed their promise, their commitment, their love. As they stood there, embraced beneath the vast, star-studded sky, a sudden gust of wind swept across the ranch, rattling the windows, stirring up the dust. The air grew heavy, the sky darkened, and the first drops of rain began to fall. A storm was breaking over Sundown Ranch. It was a fierce storm, a violent storm, with thunder that shook the ground and lightning that illuminated the sky in flashes of brilliant white. The wind howled, the rain lashed against the windows, and the ranch house seemed to creak and groan under the onslaught. Emmy and Garrett stood by the window, watching the storm rage, their arms around each other, their bodies pressed close. They were safe, protected, within the walls of the ranch house, but they knew that the storm was more than just a meteorological event. It was a symbol, a metaphor, for the challenges they had faced, the battles they had fought, the love that had endured. "It's a big one," Garrett said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the storm. "Yes," Emmy replied, her voice soft, her hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "But we'll weather it. Together." They stood there for a long time, watching the storm, their silence filled with an unspoken understanding, a shared sense of peace, of hope, of love. They knew that there would be other storms, other challenges, in their future, but they also knew that they would face them together, united by a bond that had been forged in the crucible of hardship and adversity. The storm eventually passed, the wind dying down, the rain softening to a gentle drizzle, the clouds parting to reveal a clear, star-studded sky. The air was fresh and clean, washed clean by the rain, and the ranch seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Emmy and Garrett stepped outside, onto the porch, their hands clasped together. They looked out across the land, at the vast expanse of Sundown Ranch, at the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, at the mesas rising majestically against the horizon. It was a beautiful sight, a peaceful sight, a sight that filled them with a sense of belonging. They were home, together, and they were ready to face whatever the future held, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The storm had strengthened their bond, and now everything smelled clean, fresh, and new. The very air vibrated with the promise of a new beginning. Chapter 18. Blood on the ground, tears in the dust. The peace that followed the storm was shattered, abruptly and violently. It wasn't another betrayal, another ambush, but something far more insidious, something that crept in silently, like a thief in the night. It started with the cattle. A few animals fell ill, showing signs of weakness, lethargy, and a strange, bloody cough. Emmy, with her years of experience, recognized the symptoms immediately. It was anthrax, a deadly disease that could wipe out an entire herd in a matter of days. She'd seen it before, years ago, when her father had lost half his stock to the disease. It was a devastating blow, a financial ruin that he'd never fully recovered from. She knew the urgency, the need for immediate action, but she also knew that there was little she could do. "We need to quarantine the sick animals," she said to Garrett, her voice grim, her face etched with worry. "Separate them from the rest of the herd. And we need to burn the carcasses. Every single one." It was a brutal, heartbreaking task, but it was the only way to contain the spread of the disease. They worked tirelessly, day and night, separating the sick cattle, tending to them as best they could, knowing that it was likely a futile effort. The disease spread quickly, despite their efforts. More and more cattle fell ill, their bodies racked with fever, their lungs filling with blood. The air was filled with the sounds of their suffering, their mournful bellows echoing across the ranch. Emmy watched, her heart breaking, as her herd, her livelihood, her legacy, was decimated by the disease. She felt helpless, overwhelmed by the scale of the devastation. She'd faced challenges before, rustlers, outlaws, the harsh realities of frontier life, but this was different. This was a silent killer, an invisible enemy that she couldn't fight, couldn't defeat. Garrett worked alongside her, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and helplessness. He'd seen death before, he'd caused death before, but this was different. This was the slow, agonizing death of innocent creatures, the destruction of a way of life. They burned the carcasses, the flames leaping high into the night sky, the smoke carrying the stench of death across the land. It was a grim, horrifying task, but it was necessary. It was the only way to prevent the disease from spreading further, from infecting other ranches, other herds. Jed and Billy helped, their faces somber, their movements mechanical. They'd lost cattle to disease before, but never on this scale. They knew the implications, the financial ruin that awaited them. As they were working, burning the carcasses, Emmy noticed something off. One of the dead animals, a young calf, had a strange mark on its flank, a small, circular scar that she didn't recognize. She examined it closely, her heart pounding with a sudden, chilling realization. It wasn't a natural scar. It was a brand that didn't belong to Sundown Ranch. She showed it to Garrett, her voice trembling. This isn't our brand, she said. This calf, it doesn't belong to us. Garrett examined the mark, his eyes narrowing. He recognized it immediately. It was the brand of a neighboring ranch, a ranch owned by a man named Bartlett. Bartlett was a ruthless, ambitious man who'd been trying to expand his holdings for years. He'd made offers to buy Sundown Ranch before, offers that Emmy had always refused. He was known for his underhanded tactics, his willingness to do whatever it took to get what he wanted. He did this, Garrett said, his voice low and dangerous, his eyes flashing with anger. He infected our herd. On purpose. Emmy felt a surge of rage, a burning fury that consumed her. She couldn't believe it, couldn't comprehend the cruelty, the malice of such an act. Bartlett had deliberately infected her cattle, knowing the devastation it would cause, knowing the financial ruin it would bring. We have to confront him, Emmy said, her voice trembling with rage. We have to make him pay. It's too dangerous, Emmy, Garrett said, his voice concerned. Bartlett's a powerful man. He has connections. He won't hesitate to kill us. I don't care, Emmy said, her voice unwavering. I'm not letting him get away with this. He's destroyed our herd, our livelihood. He's murdered our animals. She looked at Garrett, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger, grief, and determination. She wouldn't back down. She wouldn't let Bartlett win. They rode out, Emmy and Garrett, their rifles ready, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and righteous fury. They were riding into a confrontation, a showdown, that would test their courage, their resolve, their love. The ground was soaked in the blood of her cattle, and the air carried the scent of death. But above the physical carnage rose a different, stronger scent, a powerful and unmistakable aroma. The scent was of bitter, terrible betrayal. Chapter 19. A choice made under a dying Sunday. They found Bartlett at his ranch, a sprawling, opulent spread that contrasted sharply with the devastation at Sundown. He was sitting on his porch, sipping whiskey, his face smug, his eyes filled with a cold arrogance. His men, a dozen or so rough-looking characters, were lounging around the yard, their guns prominently displayed. Well, Bartlett said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, as Emmy and Garrett rode up. Look what the cat dragged in. To what do I owe the pleasure? You know why we're here, Bartlett, Emmy said, her voice trembling with rage, her hand tightening on her rifle. You infected our herd. You murdered our cattle. Bartlett laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that sent a shiver down Emmy's spine. Prove it, he sneered. You have no proof. We found one of your calves among our dead, Garrett said, his voice low and dangerous. With your brand on it. Bartlett's smile faltered for a moment, his eyes flickering with unease. But it was fleeting. He quickly regained his composure, his face hardening into a mask of defiance. "That's a lie," he said. "You're trying to frame me. You're desperate, Sullivan. You're losing everything, and you're trying to blame me." "You're the liar, Bartlett," Emmy said, her voice rising.
You've always wanted Sundown Ranch.
"You've tried to buy it, you've threatened me, and now you've resorted to this. You're a coward, a murderer, and you're going to pay." Bartlett stood up, his face contorted with rage. "You're trespassing, Sullivan," he said, his voice sharp. "Get off my land, before I have my men remove you." "We're not leaving," Garrett said, his voice firm, his eyes locking with Bartlett's. "Not until we get justice. Not until you pay for what you've done." "You want justice?" Bartlett sneered. "I'll give you justice." He nodded to his men, and they raised their rifles, aiming them at Emmy and Garrett.
"Get them!"
Bartlett shouted. Gunfire erupted, the shots echoing across the yard, the bullets whizzing past Emmy and Garrett's heads. They dismounted, taking cover behind their horses, returning fire. It was a chaotic, desperate gunfight, a whirlwind of bullets and shouts and screams. Emmy and Garrett were outnumbered, outgunned, but they fought with a fierce determination, a righteous fury that fueled their actions. Emmy saw one of Bartlett's men fall, shot by Garrett. She saw another go down, clutching his leg, screaming in pain. She herself fired her rifle, aiming at the men who were threatening her, threatening Garrett, threatening everything she held dear. But they were losing. They were being pushed back, forced to retreat. Emmy saw Garrett take a bullet in the arm, his face contorting with pain, his body jerking violently.
"Garrett!"
she screamed, her voice filled with anguish. He staggered, but he didn't fall. He continued to fire, his face grim, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. Emmy knew they couldn't win. They were surrounded, overwhelmed. They had to escape, to get away, to live to fight another day. "We have to go," she shouted to Garrett, her voice urgent. "We can't stay here." He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of pain, regret, and love. He knew she was right. They had to leave. They mounted their horses, spurring them forward, riding away from the ranch, away from the gunfire, away from the chaos. Bartlett's men pursued them, their bullets still flying, their shouts echoing in the distance. They rode hard, their horses' hooves pounding on the hard ground, their hearts pounding with fear and desperation. They had to get away, to find shelter, to survive. As they rode, the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the land. The sky turned a fiery red, the color of blood, the color of death. Emmy looked at Garrett, his face pale, his arm bleeding, his body weakened by the fight. She knew he was hurt, badly, and she feared for his life. They reached a small, secluded canyon, a place where they could hide, rest, regroup. They dismounted, their bodies exhausted, their spirits broken. Emmy tended to Garrett's wound, cleaning it, bandaging it as best she could. He was weak, feverish, and she knew he needed medical attention soon. We have to get you to a doctor," she said, her voice trembling. He shook his head, his face grim. "No," he said, his voice weak. We can't. Bartlett, he'll be looking for us. He'll kill us." Emmy looked at him, her eyes filled with despair. She knew he was right. They were trapped, cornered, with nowhere to go. She looked out across the land, at the dying sun, at the blood-red sky, and she felt a profound sense of loss. She'd lost everything, she realized. Her herd, her ranch, her future. And she was about to lose Garrett. She had a choice to make. A terrible, heartbreaking choice. She could stay with Garrett, knowing that Bartlett would find them, kill them both. Or she could leave, seek help, try to save herself, but abandon Garrett to his fate. It was a choice between loyalty and survival, between love and life. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the canyon into darkness, Emmy made her decision. A dying sun, blood on the ground, and a choice that would change everything, forever. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Emmy made her choice. A choice born of love, of desperation, of a fierce determination to protect the man she loved, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. "I'm going for help," she said, her voice trembling but firm, her eyes meeting Garrett's. "I'm going to get you to a doctor. I'm going to save you." He tried to protest, his face contorted with pain and a fierce protectiveness, but she silenced him with a gentle touch, a tender kiss. "No," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "I won't let you die, Garrett. I won't lose you. I love you too much." She left him hidden in the canyon, promising to return, her heart breaking with each step she took away from him. She rode through the night, her horse's hooves pounding on the hard ground, her mind racing, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. She rode to the nearest town, a small, dusty settlement that offered little in the way of comfort or assistance. But she knew she had to try. She had to find a doctor, someone who could help Garrett, someone who could save his life. She found the town doctor, an old, weary man who'd seen his share of frontier violence and suffering. She pleaded with him, begged him to come with her, to help Garrett, offering him everything she had left, her horse, her saddle, her rifle, her wedding ring, the last tangible reminder of her marriage to Thomas. The doctor, moved by her desperation, by her unwavering love, agreed to help. They rode back to the canyon, their hearts pounding with anticipation and fear, their hopes hanging by a thread. They found Garrett where she'd left him, his condition worsened, his breathing shallow and ragged, his face pale and drawn. The doctor examined him quickly, his face grim, his movements efficient. "He's lost a lot of blood," he said, his voice low and serious. "He needs surgery. He needs a hospital." Emmy felt a wave of despair wash over her. A hospital? It was miles away, days away. Garrett wouldn't survive the journey. But then, the doctor surprised her. He told her that, years ago, he'd been a surgeon. A good one. He'd left that life behind, but maybe he could do something. Here.
Now.
It was a risky, desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. Emmy agreed, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fragile hope. The doctor set up a makeshift operating table, using blankets and supplies he'd brought with him. He worked quickly, efficiently, his hands surprisingly steady, his movements precise. Emmy assisted him, her hands trembling, her heart aching, as he removed the bullet, cleaned the wound, and stitched it closed. It was a long, agonizing process, a brutal, bloody ordeal. Emmy watched, her eyes fixed on Garrett's face, willing him to live, praying for a miracle. Finally, it was over. The doctor stepped back, his face exhausted, his clothes stained with blood. "I've done all I can," he said, his voice weary. "Now it's up to him." Emmy sat beside Garrett, holding his hand, her eyes fixed on his face. She watched his chest rise and fall with each shallow breath, listening to the faint beat of his heart, willing him to survive. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in a haze of worry and exhaustion. The sun rose, casting its warm rays through the canyon, illuminating the scene in a soft, golden light. Finally, he stirred. His eyelids fluttered, and he groaned softly. Emmy leaned closer, her heart leaping with hope. "Garrett?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly, his blue eyes clouded with pain and confusion. He looked at her, his gaze unfocused, then recognition dawned in his eyes. "Emmy?" he whispered, his voice weak and raspy. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm here. You're going to be all right." He smiled, a faint, weak smile that reached his eyes, and Emmy felt a wave of relief wash over her. He was alive. He was going to survive. But their ordeal wasn't over. As Garrett was regaining consciousness, they heard the sound of horses approaching, the familiar, menacing sound of Bartlett and his men. They'd found them. Emmy knew they were trapped, cornered, with no escape. She looked at Garrett, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "It's over, Emmy," he whispered, his voice weak. We can't fight them." Emmy refused to give up. It wasn't over. Not yet. She grabbed her rifle. But before she could react, before she could even raise the gun, a voice rang out, strong and clear. "Hold it right there, Bartlett." It wasn't Garrett. It wasn't the doctor.
It was Jed.
And behind him rode a posse of townsfolk, armed and ready. Billy had ridden ahead once Emmy left for town, and gathered help. Bartlett and his men, surprised, outnumbered, hesitated for a moment, then surrendered, their weapons dropping to the ground. The final confrontation was over. Not with a hail of bullets, but with the quiet, determined strength of a community, united against injustice. Emmy had saved Garrett. Garrett had saved the ranch. They had weathered every storm, and it looked like they were safe. But now came the real test. The real final confrontation. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Epilogue. The years that followed were a tapestry woven with threads of hardship and happiness, challenge and contentment. Sundown Ranch slowly recovered, its scars healing, its spirit renewed. Emmy, with Garrett by her side, rebuilt her herd, stronger and more resilient than before. They faced droughts and storms, market fluctuations, and the ever-present challenges of frontier life, but they faced them together, their love a constant source of strength, their partnership a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Jed, fully recovered, remained their loyal foreman, his initial suspicion of Garrett replaced by a deep respect and a grudging affection. Billy, too, stayed on, his youthful enthusiasm tempered by the experiences he'd shared, his loyalty to Emmy and Garrett unwavering. Sheriff Buckley served his time, his confession leading to the arrest of several other corrupt officials, his actions ultimately cleansing the territory of a long-standing stain of injustice. He emerged from prison a changed man, humbled and remorseful, seeking redemption not in the law, but in a quiet life of service to others. Bartlett, stripped of his power and wealth, was sentenced to a long prison term, his ambition and cruelty ultimately leading to his downfall. The threat he'd posed to Sundown Ranch, to Emmy and Garrett, was extinguished, his name a bitter reminder of the darkness they'd overcome. Emmy and Garrett, their love tested and strengthened by adversity, finally found the peace and happiness they'd so desperately sought. They married in a simple ceremony beneath the vast, open sky of Sundown Ranch, surrounded by the people they loved, the land they cherished. They built a life together, a life filled with the rhythms of the ranch, the changing seasons, the simple joys of shared meals, quiet evenings on the porch, and the comforting presence of each other. They faced the challenges of aging, the inevitable aches and pains, the slowing of their bodies, but their hearts remained young, their love undiminished. They never had children of their own, but they found a family in each other, in Jed and Billy, in the community that had rallied around them in their time of need. Sundown Ranch became a haven, a place of refuge and renewal, not just for them, but for others who sought a new beginning, a second chance. As the years turned into decades, Emmy and Garrett watched the frontier transform, the wild, untamed land slowly giving way to progress, to civilization. The days of outlaws and rustlers faded into legend, replaced by the steady march of modernity, of automobiles and telephones and electric lights. But Sundown Ranch remained, a testament to their resilience, their love, their unwavering commitment to the land, to each other. It stood as a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the harshest of environments, love could flourish, dreams could be realized, and second chances were possible. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set, painting the sky in a breathtaking display of color, Emmy, her hair now silver, her face etched with the lines of a life well lived, turned to Garrett, his blue eyes still sparkling with the same love and devotion she'd seen in them all those years ago. "We did it, Garrett," she said, her voice soft, her hand reaching out to take his. "We made it." He smiled, a slow, tender smile that reached his eyes, a smile that spoke of a lifetime of shared experiences, of challenges overcome, of love that had endured. "We did, Emmy," he said, his voice filled with a quiet contentment.
We did.
He squeezed her hand, and they sat there, together, in the peaceful silence of the evening, beneath the vast, star-studded sky of Sundown Ranch, their hearts filled with gratitude, with love, with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, a love well earned. The horizon stretched before them, not as a symbol of uncertainty, but as a promise of enduring peace. The ranch was quiet. The sky was beautiful. They were together. The end.